Welcome, everyone, to the 36th in our series on Middle Eastern and North African Islamic history. Today, we're going to talk about the Qajar dynasty, who ruled over Persia primarily in the 19th century, but also a little bit in the prior 18th century and a little bit into the 20th century. So, for those of you who are familiar, please don't begrudge me as I go over the rules. So, this is not an academic presentation. I am not accredited in history, philosophy, religion, or any of the disciplines that we're going to be discussing today. This is going to be a secular presentation. Despite the fact that I will talk about religious topics and religious histories, I'm going to try and give it from a historical perspective as opposed to a theological one. And of course, given the sensitivity of these topics, please be respectful. That said, I love interactivity. Please, questions, comments, clarifications, please put them in the chat. I do read the chat and respond in real time. What I always say is that these classes are a 101 and a 201, meaning that if you know nothing, right, it's a 101, it'll catch you up. And if you know something, it'll tell you that extra information, that 201 that you probably didn't know. And when I put dates below a person, that's their years of service in whatever role they're holding, be it a general, an emir, a shah. When I put those dates, those are their dates of service in those roles. I also have a rule that there's a 2-hour hard stop. So if I don't get to all of my slides by the end of 2 hours, that's okay. We'll just pick this up another time and continue from where we left off. We will continue any discussions that we're having over that 2-hour limit, but no new information. And finally, like the other 35 entries in this series, and like everything else that History Mostly Ancient Discussions has put forward, such as its Roman history series, its Greek history series, its European Union series, its Crusade series, and its series, this will be recorded so you can watch it later and compare with some of the other episodes in this series to see the trajectory that we have been going down. All right, so given the amount that we have to discuss today, I decided to forego the quiz and instead just go through a more rigorous review of what we've done before. So when we got to the end of the Safavid dynasty at the beginning of the 18th century, the Safavids, who had really shaped Persia for over 200 years, were now seeing attacks from all sides, right? They had attacks from the north, from Russia, and from the Lezgins, from the south, from the Sunni Arabs and the Balochis. But the worst invasion, of course, was that of the Hotakis. And the Hotakis came from Afghanistan and were able to defeat a significantly larger Safavid army, besiege the city of Isfahan, and in so doing, they destroyed that capital city of the Safavids. Into this moment, to defend what remained of the Safavid Empire, came Nadir Shah. Nadir Shah, as we mentioned, came from a Turkic tribe, the Afshar tribe, and he was not of any royal house, lineage, or even noble family. He was a relatively poor individual, but he had a supreme ability with military command, and we spent much of the last 2 sessions discussing how he was able to not only win back Isfahan from the Hotakis, but expand the Persian Empire in new and interesting directions. In particular, he pushed the boundaries, sacking the city of Delhi and recovering over 87 million pounds at that time worth of jewels. He was able to hold the Ottomans back, and were not for rebellions within his own empire, could possibly have pushed the Ottoman border further west. And he had successful raids in Oman, in Khiva, in Bukhara. But the problem with him was that he repressed the Persian people significantly. He made skull towers from those who refused to support him. And he also heavily taxed the population. And then when it finally got up to his courtiers, those courtiers assassinated him in 1747, leading Iran to fall into decay for the latter part of the 18th century. As Iran contracted, many of the leaders that Nadir Shah had put in power outside of Iran began to coalesce. And one of those was the eastern part of Georgia. Georgia had been divided in the west, which was a suzerain of the Ottoman Empire, and in the east, which was a suzerain of the Safavids, and then Nadir Shah as their inheritor. But as Persia came in, the kingdoms of Kartli and Kakheti, which were ruled by King Teimuraz II, and his son Erekle II, Teimuraz II basically allowed his son to inherit the kingdom of Kartli when he died. And so Kartli Kakheti became a united state. And surprisingly for the history of Georgia, they decided to put their bet with Russia, that Russia would defend the territory. And one of the other issues that we talked about is that Georgia is not the only state in the Caucasus region. One of the unique things is that the state of Greater Armenia, the Armenia that was ruled by the Bagratid dynasty about 1,000 years ago, that kingdom had a number of vassal kingdoms within it. And one of those vassal kingdoms was the kingdom of Artsakh, which was the only one to remain under Armenian control for centuries. Although it didn't remain as a single kingdom, it remained as 5 melikdoms, or 5 minor kingdoms. And you can see that they occupy an area roughly analogous with the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast as that existed during the Soviet period. So this is within the territory of the modern state of Azerbaijan and the unrecognized state of Artsakh Republic. So these 5 melikdoms were really the only place in the world where Armenians were, to a certain degree, politically powerful. In other places, Armenians were ruled by their Catholicos, their religious leader, and had a number of rights that were connected to that. For example, in the Ottoman Empire, you had the Millet Pasha, or leader of the nation, who reported to the Ottoman Sultan. And in other parts of the Safavid Empire, Armenians had their own representatives, religious representatives, in the court of the Shah. But here in this region, the Armenians actually had a certain degree of political autonomy. And we discussed last time how, with the withdrawal of Iran from the region, a number of the Turkic states that existed in the Southern Caucasus, that if we speak anachronistically, we can call Azerbaijani, a number of these groups began to expand their power. And one of them was the Khan of Karabakh, that's Pana Ali Khan Javanshir. You can see him in the upper left-hand side. And he worked with a number of Armenian meliks who were willing to turn on other Armenian meliks in order to consolidate his control over the region of Artsakh. So we discussed last time, for example, how Melik Shahnazar II, the usurper, allied himself with Pana Ali Khan against the other 4 meliks, which couldn't destroy him, but yet he couldn't prevail against them either. We also talked about how Afghanistan became inherited by the Durrani being the subset of Abdali Pashtuns that had served loyally with Nadir Shah, and therefore became his dominant successor in that region. Taking after Nadir Shah, the Abdalis decided to create a multi-ethnic state in what is now Afghanistan, where Pashtuns would be the dominant ethnicity, but Turkmens, Uzbeks, Hazara, and other groups that form the rich ethnic tapestry of Afghanistan could be part and parcel of his state and even have high-ranking positions in the empire. After the Third Battle of Panipat, the Durrani Empire had successfully defeated the Marathas, which were a Hindu-Indian government just south of his border. If you look on the map, it would have been between the Qajar dynasty and the Mughal Empire in that area that's where there's nothing written. And the Duranis kept enough distance between them and the British East India Company that there were positive relations between both of these entities. They weren't competing over land. We also talked about what happened to the center of Iran after the death of Nadir Shah. And we discussed how there was a lot of infighting between Nadir Shah's family and also between the different ethnic, social, and political groups that had assembled during Nadir Shah's reign. The one that managed to prevail were the Zands, led by Karim Khan. And he was able to rule as Vakil Raya, the agent of the people, from 1765 until his death in 1779. It's notable that Karim Khan never took the title of Shah, preferring to allow the last remaining Safavid to have that title despite him having no real power. And when that Safavid died, so did the possibility of the Safavids ever coming back to power again. One of the slaves in Karim Khan's court was Ağa Muhammad. And Ağa Muhammad Khan was himself a Qajar, which is a Qızılbaş Turkish tribe. So different than the Afsharids, different Turkic tribe, but still Turkic as well. And Ağa Muhammad was castrated. There's a question of, did the Durrani eventually evolve into Pakistan, or is that unrelated? Pakistan was a creation of the British Empire, right? So they didn't evolve into Pakistan. The Durrani Empire is the forerunner to the Emirate of Afghanistan. And that's the trajectory of the Durrani. So, as I was mentioning with Ağa Muhammad, he was castrated at the age of 6, and so he had a long-standing enmity towards those who had enslaved him from the Afshar tribe. But as long as Karim Khan was alive, he swore loyalty to him. When he found out that his master had died in 1779, he began an attempt to consolidate the different Turkic tribes together. Especially those that were also Qızılbaş, but not necessarily Qajar, like the Develu. And he led a very mean-spirited war against the one Zand pretender who managed to actually consolidate power relatively effectively, and that was the nephew of Karim Khan, Lutf Ali. And the two of them fought throughout the late 1780s and 1790s. In particular, we have that story where Haji Ibrahim Shirazi, who was the mayor or Kalantar of the city of Shiraz, actually locked Lutf Ali Khan out of his own city because of his alliance with Ağa Muhammad. And we also had the story, the very painful story, of when Lutf Ali Khan hid in the city of Kerman, a city that remained loyal to him for 2 years of siege. When that city finally fell, Ağa Muhammad ordered his soldiers to blind every man in the city and to take all the women and children as slaves. Lutf Ali Khan was not spared. He too was blinded and tortured to death. And we talked about how Ağa Muhammad also had a love of jewels, and he murdered the last Afsharid ruler, Shah, the grandson of Nadir Shah, in order, first he tortured him to find out the location of whatever jewels he may have possessed. And after getting that information, Shah died in transit to where his new home would be in the city. And we also talked about how, in an attempt to reclaim the territories of the former Persian Empire, Ağa Muhammad then sent military troops into Karli, right? That kingdom that had sworn loyalty to the Russians in 1783 with the Treaty of Georgievsk. Now, Ağa Muhammad first sacked Tbilisi with the help of the Khan of Ganja, which is a city-state in Azerbaijan. You can see it on the map here. It's labeled as Samchalat or Samkhalat. And no, sorry, Ganja is just south of Karlikakhet there. But anyway, this tribal affiliation would later play into the Caucasus relationships that we're going to see in a few seconds. But it wasn't just Karlikakhet that fought against the incoming Persians under the Qajars. Solomon II of Imereti, which was under Turkish suzerainty, under Ottoman suzerainty, decided to send as many soldiers as it could, which wasn't many, but it meant that Karlikakhet wasn't standing alone. And so that ended up resulting in the Battle of Kirtsanisi, which was a major defeat for the Georgians against these new Qajar forces. So what ends up happening is that Ağa Muhammad dies. He's killed by his courtiers. We sort of discussed that last time. In the year 1797, he sentenced them to death for making too much noise, but decided not to chain them overnight. Turns out, bad idea. So you have this situation that's very much, as I said, like Game of Thrones, where you have these different khanates, right? You can see three of the khans that I've just chosen to mention here. You have Karlikakhet, which is being ruled at least partially by Alexander Alexei, son of Irakli II. You have Avari, which is ruled by the Avar people, and their ruler is Omar Khan. And you have Karabakh, which is led by the successor to Pana Ali Khan, which was Ibrahim Khalil Khan. Now, these khans were always jockeying and pushing for different positions. So you had situations, for example, like Ibrahim Khalil was trying to conquer and put down the remaining Armenian meliks that were still either suzerains or defiant to Pana Ali Khan when the latter had died. And so you ended up having some of these meliks reaching out to other khans. You can see the Khanate of Ganja just north of Karabakh and the Khanate of Sheki as well. And so they would create erstwhile alliances with these khans against the Khanate of Karabakh. It was all this sort of wheeling and dealing and underhanded relationships to try and resolve these issues. In fact, one of the things that Ibrahim Khalil did to try and control the Armenians under his territory was to create what was called an anti-Catholicos, because the Catholicos is the religious representative of the Armenians, and anti-Catholicos is like a Babylonian captivity on the Orthodox side, meaning that you have another leader who claims to be the Catholicos, and this leader has a different political position than the primary Catholicos. And so Ibrahim Khalil did this in order to bring more Armenians into loyalty with him, because they would be following this anti-Catholicos. Some Armenians continued to resist, and in 1783, they sent a letter, a secretive letter to Catherine the Great of Russia, urging her to intervene and to liberate them from the Muslims in Karabakh. This letter, however, was intercepted by allies of the anti-Catholicos. So these were Armenians who intercepted an Armenian letter to seek help from the Russians to protect Armenians from what we can call today Azerbaijanis. Once this was discovered, of course, the Meliks who had authored it escaped to the Khanate of Ganja. This led Ibrahim Khalil to reach out to Alexei, son of Irakli II, to encircle Ganja because they had because Karlikakhet had grievances with Ganja as well. And so you have these sort of pulling and pushing between these different states, especially in this latter half of the 18th century into the beginning of the 19th century, before the Russians established complete control after the first decade of the 19th century. You also have this situation where because these groups are increasingly resistant to a large player coming onto the scene, they will ally with one of the major powers, be it the Ottomans, the Persians, or the Russians, if it means that they can throw out the other major power. And so we're going to see that in a bit as well. So the Russians first try a heavy hand in bringing back Georgia into its fold. Remember, the Qajars had forced the Georgians to surrender after the Battle of Kırtsanisi. And so they sent their general Pavel Tsitsianov, who actually was an ethnic Georgian himself. He was related to Vakhtang the Sixth. After he had moved to Russia, he moved with a number of other Georgians, and Pavel Tsitsianov was a descendant of them. That did not dispose him any better, however, to the people there, and he was incredibly unpopular, so much so that he was assassinated in 1806. As he was near the city of Baku. And this result and the incursion of the Russians led to a very interesting offer from the Persians, which was an alliance with Persia against to hold the Russians out. And so we end up seeing Prince Alexei of Karlikakheti and Omar Khan of Avari deciding to jointly support the Persians in fighting the Russians, despite the fact that Prince Alexei's father, Arakli II, had actually sought out the Russians for help. So you have this weird fighting back and forward. For Alexei's point, he was not allowed to assume the position of king of Karlikakheti because the Russians had turned Karlikakheti into a governorate under their control instead of leaving it in the traditional Georgian hands. That was one of the things that Pavel Tsitsianov had done. And so the Persian offer to restore him to the throne was something that he was willing to accept for either Persian suzerainty or perhaps just an alliance in the long term. So one of the big picture things that we need to sort of look at when we're understanding this 19th century in Iran is the Great Game. And yeah, I don't know why that text is there. Is the Great Game. And the Great Game is this confluence between the Russian presence expanding out from Moscow and St. Petersburg further towards the south and to the east, and the British expansion from the area around the Bengal into more and more of India. And these empires were getting closer and closer together, trying to figure out how to divide Central Asia between them. And the British were afraid of the Russians entering India, not unfounded fear, and the Russians were afraid of being cut off before they had taken as much territory in Central Asia as they could. You can see the Russians were advancing in the Caucasus to take what are traditionally Persian territories in the modern day countries of Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, as well as what's now southern Russia, areas like Derbent. And the British were moving into areas of historic Persian control as well, such as parts of what's today Pakistan and Afghanistan. And so both of these empires saw Persia as a buffer state as the two of them were expanding towards each other. So it's worth talking a little bit about Fath Ali Shah. And Fath Ali is the man in the very long beard. He's very distinctive. We have dozens of portraits of him. He loved painting himself, getting himself painted. And he took power in 1797. The way he did this was that one of the few things that Ağa Muhammad Khan did that was not callous was that he set up a clear line of succession. And despite the fact that he was unable to give birth, he was able to do this by giving power to his nephew, and that's who Fath Ali is. So you can see him. This is a painting that he gave to the British of himself, and you can see 22 of his sons there. And the title, of course, of the painting is Fath Ali Shah hunting with his 22 sons. The title is misleading, though. He had 268 sons by over 150 different women. And he is, in Persian history, I believe, the most prolific ruler in that regard. We talked about in episode 32. No, sorry. Yeah, episode 32, we talked about Mulay Ismail, who actually had more children and more wives. So he's not the most prolific monarch of all time, but he is the most prolific in Persian history. There's a question of, wasn't Afghanistan the buffer state between Britain and Russia? Afghanistan was one of the buffer states. Persia was the other. So it's worth talking for a second about what Fath Ali did in terms of his organization of the state. And he was an individual who noticed how badly Persia had been hurting after the 18th century. We talked about Nader Shah and all the rebellions that he had to put down. We talked about the internecine fighting between Karim Khan and all of the other rulers in other parts of Persia that he had to overtake. And the end of Ağa Muhammad chasing Lutf Ali Khan all around Persia, massacring entire cities, such as the blinding of Kerman. So Persia, through this last 18th century, had been suffering an incredible amount and was on the verge almost always of fracturing again into civil war. So Fath Ali Khan decided to go back to the traditional Persian methods of governance, which is that you rely on local tribes to self-govern in a very devolved sort of way, right? The lesson of Nader Shah had been that if you try to unify Persia into one multicultural, singular multi-ethnic state based in a capital city, that will breed high taxes, large military expenditures, and local resentment. So Fath Ali decided to go to the local tribes and deal with them as individual tribes. And in this way, he was actually able to keep most of Persia, Caucasus accepted, right? Because we're going to talk about the Caucasus in a few minutes. But except for the Caucasus, almost all of Persia under his rule was a safe place to be, a place where warfare didn't break out. And he ruled for 37 years. So that's not a easy thing to say. Another thing we have to understand is what the Persian economy looked like under him. First of all, it was growing. You can see you can see trade and the bazaars really developing in this period. And the Persians began to trade, especially with the West, and produce their own goods. But for the moment, at the beginning of the 19th century, generally speaking, Persians consumed mostly Persian-made products. And you have to realize the strong internal trade networks in Persia between the nomadic people and the sedentary people. At the beginning of the 19th century, and this really wouldn't change until the beginning of the 20th century, over 30% of Persians, and by Persians I mean inhabitants of the empire, not necessarily ethnic Persians, over 30% of Persians were not sedentary people. They were nomadic people who moved throughout localized areas of Persia, right? They wouldn't change from region to region, but they weren't sedentary. They would follow their flocks. They would raise their sheep in different places. And these people would be cultivating all kinds of goods that pastoralists can cultivate, things like milk and meat, wool for clothes, and they would trade with the sedentary populations for fruits and vegetables and manufactures. And this economy was growing during the period of Fath Ali Shah. For most Persians, despite what we're going to talk about in the Caucasus, which was deeply damaging, most Persians didn't experience that. Most Persians experienced a light economic improvement and a definite improvement in the quality of life without all these rebellions. There's a question as to what the illustration is on the lower right-hand side. Yes, that is a marketplace. That's in current Iran today. And you have a lot of small markets. You also can see that this market in particular has a small area for people to drink tea. I presume that there are tea sellers in the area. Now, it's worth pointing out that Persia during the time of Fath Ali Shah is not in a vacuum. There are other world politics that are going on that will slowly begin to include Persia. And the first one of these is France's interest in India, in particularly the kingdom of Mysore, ruled by Tipu Sultan. And we talked about this a lot in episode 29. But to sort of touch on what's important here, the French saw several different beachheads on their way to India. The first and major one was Egypt, believing that if they conquered Egypt, they would have a direct route. Of course, the Suez Canal wasn't built at this time, but a direct overland route to then get to the Red Sea and then go to India to support Mysore. So Egypt was definitely an interest of France's, but so was Iran, because Iran guarded the northwest entrance into India. The Durrani Empire sometimes controlled the territory along the coast. Sometimes it was under the Nawab of Sindh. Sometimes it was the independent state of Makran. Whichever state it was, didn't control that territory terribly well because of the mountainous terrain that extended across the border between the Durrani Empire and the Sikh Empire. So establishing good relations with Iran would be helpful in facilitating a French invasion of Mysore. And we know from the diplomats that the French sent to Persia, they were given two major instructions. The first one was to try to form an alliance with Iran, if possible, and in so doing, exclude the British from being able to visit Iran. And second, to draw very clear and detailed cartographical and topographical maps of the northwestern region of India, as you would access it from Persia, right? Forecasting that there would be the possibility of an invasion based in Persia against the British client states in order to support Mysore and other Indian princely states willing to support the French against the British. And so we have this very strange situation going on. Okay. We have this very strange situation going on in terms of the allies that would be trying to facilitate relations with Persia. So as I said, in 1796, the French sent their mission, and the French were able to get a treaty signed that would forbid the British from coming into Iran. There's a question, is it reasonable to postulate that some of the long-standing conflict in these areas may stem from the challenges of evolving from nomadism to more sedentary organization? Did the amount of nomadic lifestyle make these areas more easily conquered by colonizing powers? So the second question is easier to answer. It's the opposite. Areas with large nomadic populations were very difficult for conquerors to control because conquerors, especially in the European model, are oriented around cities and guarding and protecting cities. So nomadic cultures were difficult for them to take over. It's not the opposite. To the first question, there definitely were issues moving from a significantly partially nomadic society to a fully sedentary society. But the primary issue with many of these countries was the way that modernization reforms took place and the way that internal politics was exploited by the imperialists in a way that would prevent the creation of reform. So we're going to see both of those in Iran today. Yeah, the Ottoman Empire is a little bit less emphasis on the imperialists and more emphasis on the internal issues in the Ottoman Empire between the young Ottomans and movements like that and the more autocratic tendencies of a number of the sultans. And we're going to see that when we return to the Ottoman Empire in 2 or 3 weeks. It's on the calendar. Okay. So the East India Company was the first British the East India Company was the first British entity that sought to have relations with Iran. Now, notice that it's the East India Company and not the British government itself. Um, the East India Company had its own diplomatic corps, its own governor general, who was responsible for making decisions. And accordingly, the East India Company can almost be thought of until the development of the overland telegraph from Russia in the 1870s as an independent government, even though it's closely tied with the government in London. And so you see John Malcolm, who was the emissary of the East India Company. He arrives in Persia in 1801. He can only go to the city of Bushehr, which is a port city on the coast of the Persian Gulf, because under the French treaty, he was not allowed to step foot further into Iran. But he is able to conclude the Treaty of Friendship with the Persians in 1801. And this treaty is a mirror image of the French treaty in that it would give business and mercantile concessions to British, and the French would be forbidden from entering the territory. And part of that treaty was that the British would assist the Shah in developing his military. And you can see in the lower left-hand side, that's an image of the British in the court of Fath Ali Shah. You can see the Shah just to the right of them, and they're all wearing red boots as was required in the Persian court. But then the Napoleonic War breaks out in Europe, and the Russians are the allies of the British. So the alliance that the Qajar sought with the British was to improve their military to fight against the Russians, who were making those incursions in the Caucasus. The British, for their part, wanted to secure Iran to protect India. But now that Russia was an ally, they couldn't well be helping the enemy of their ally. And so, to a certain degree, they soured on the alliance. So, the French stepped in. And the French were willing, starting in 1804, to receive Persian envoys, and they finally met in Finkenstein Palace, which is in Central Europe. It's in April of 1807, and when they met there, Napoleon signed an alliance with them that would run counter to the British alliance. Now, because Russia was an enemy of Napoleon's as well. But that only lasted on Napoleon's side for 3 months, because in July of 1807, there was the Battle of Tilsit, which resulted in Russia surrendering to the French and pledging to be a French ally. So now the French could no longer maintain an alliance with Persia, because that alliance with Persia was anti-Russian. So the British began courting the Persians, and in 1808, they signed a new treaty. But then, in 1810, Napoleon invaded Russia. So once Napoleon invaded Russia, Russia was on the British side again. In 1812, he invaded Russia. So in 1812, Russia was on the British side again, and the British couldn't well support Persia against Russia if Russia was an ally. So the British sort of began to pull out of that alliance as well. And you can sort of see from the Persian perspective, these French-British entrees into Persia seem at best cynical, and at worst completely disinterested in Persian needs, wants, and desires. Just to remind everybody what was going on with the Ottoman Empire at this time, you had General Kutuzov, who you can see on the right-hand side, who was leading the Russian invasion into Ottoman-held Bulgaria, and that was a successful victory for the Russians. The Ottomans remained a British ally through much of the war, even though, they were a British ally in the very beginning of the war until they became a French ally after the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805. And that's how they remained throughout the war, a French ally. All right. So we have the Russo-Persian War of 1804 to 1813. And this war is really started when Pavel Tsitsianov, who you can see in the upper right-hand side, attacked the city of Ganja and laid siege to it in 1804. The Russian troops were able to take the city and bring it under Tsarist rule. Accordingly, the Qajars sought to repel this, and they sent Abbas Mirza, Prince Abbas, the son of Fatali Shah, to bring forward an army with British tactical advisors, depending on whether they were in alliance with Britain, or French tactical advisors when they were in alliance with the French, against this Russian incursion. Now, it's worth pointing out that if the Russians had brought the full force of their military into the Caucasus, the Persians wouldn't have had a chance. But the Russians didn't do that at all. The Russians were dealing with Napoleon at the time, and that's where the brunt of their military allocations were. Additionally, the territory in the Caucasus was incredibly difficult. You can see in this painting, this is a human bridge. Those are actually Russian soldiers ducking in the ravine to allow the cannons to pass over them because of how difficult this terrain was, and how difficult it was to move artillery into this area. There was also no major railroad through this area yet, and the Georgian military highway was still under construction. So the Russians that arrived here were actually fewer in number than the Persians defending the territory. Not by one or two times, but it was noticeable that the Persians were more numerous. The Persians also had more modern equipment. The British had given them 6-pounder cannons. And so it wasn't entirely clear that the Russians would win the engagement, but the Russians won a number of critical battles. One of the battles that showed the Persians winning was the Battle of Sultanabad, where the Persians were able to use British 6-pounders, and the British advisors were able to point the Persians in the right direction in order to score the biggest victories against the Russians. Sultanabad is in the country of Azerbaijan today. So, as I mentioned, in 1809, the British signed the Treaty of Friendship and Alliance in the middle of this conflict. And the terms of the Treaty of Friendship and Alliance is that the Persians would receive help against any European power, Russia included, if Persia was not the aggressor. And Persia would receive British troops, or failing that, subsidies, cannons, muskets, and British officers in repelling such a European invasion. Conversely, Persia would not do anything to endanger the British in India. And if the Afghans were to make incursions into India, they would support the British in repulsing them. And you can see that already from 1809, as compared to that map from the late 1700s, the British had made far many more inroads into India, with the East India Company either controlling or controlling as a vassal about a third of the subcontinent. And this is why the British officers were training Persian soldiers, as we saw in the Battle of Sultanabad. But after Tsitsianov was murdered in 1806, the war continued, and the war continued under General Pyotr Kotyarevsky, who was himself a very charismatic figure. He led 2 incredibly successful battles. In October of 1812, you can see on the left-hand side, this is a picture of the Battle of Aslanduz. Aslanduz is on the Iranian side of the Aras River. The Aras River divides Azerbaijan from Iran. And this was a position where the British advisors repeatedly told Abbas Mirza, that Persian general, that he should abandon the position. It wasn't safe. And Kotyarevsky was advancing from his position on the north side of the Aras River to the south side. He would overwhelm the position very soon. Abbas Mirza refused to listen. Kotyarevsky fired his cannons upon the Persian positions. And by the time that Abbas Mirza decided to retreat, both of his British advisors had been killed, and significant amounts of his own soldiers were killed in the retreat. In fact, more Persian soldiers died from the bad retreat than had died in the initial barrages from the Russian forces. Aslan Dost was a critical Russian success that was followed by them marching on the city of Lankaran along the Caspian coast, besieging the city and killing everybody inside. Even the Lankaran defenders, the Persians and Turks that were defending the castle, even those that had surrendered to the Russians were massacred on sight, despite being given promises of clemency. The way that the Russians treated the Persians in these last two battles left a very bitter taste in the mouth for most Persians, despite the fact that they couldn't do anything about it. And the reason that they couldn't do much about it was that their military had been hamstrung by all of these engagements. So Sir Gora Ouseley of the British Foreign Ministry was sent, in accordance with the Treaty of Alliance and Friendship, to negotiate between the Persians and the Russians concerning the territory in the Caucasus. And they came up with what is called the Treaty of Gulistan, called such because it was signed in the Persian city of Gulistan. Now, all of the area in that sort of purplish shade was the area that was ceded by Persia to the Russians. Many of these territories, including Dagestan, the eastern part of Georgia, much of the Republic of Azerbaijan today, these were territories that had been in Persian hands in one form or another for over 400 years. And the loss of these territories was very much opposed by most Persians, and they saw the British very negatively for having inspired such a treaty. Another requirement is that the Caspian Sea would become a Russian-only sea. The Russian flotilla that was built would be the only navy that would be allowed there, and the Persians would have to dismantle their Caspian Sea navy. The response to this was that there was wide-scale protest. Now, one of the things about Persia is, and we discussed it last time with the creation of the Hojat al-Islam, the Mujtahids, the Hojat al-Islam and the Ayatollah, is that you began to have this sense where these very high-ranking religious leaders would be the cultural signposts that people should follow. These were the people who were responding to the cultural needs of the time. And so you had these mullahs leading the protests in much the same way that you would have social activists lead protests today. They were simply the ones that people were imitating. They were the ones who had connected networks between the different mosques to spread information effectively. And so you had mullahs leading protests against the Treaty of Gulistan. Notwithstanding, it was honored, and the Russians took over all of that territory. That's not to say that the Russians were able to rule that territory very easily. We talked about in episode 27 on the Russo-Turkish War, the difficulty that the Russians had in controlling the Caucasus because of all of these independent regions, many of them with distinct religions. In addition to Islam and Christianity, which were, of course, the dominant religions, you also had the Buddhists of Kalmykia, and you had the Circassians, many of whom believed in the ancient religion of Khabze, which is a polytheistic, animistic kind of religion. And the way that the Russians decided to deal with it was aggressively. So there was General Alexei Yermolov. Alexei Yermolov was very distinguished for his actions against the French during the Napoleonic Wars, specifically during the Battle of Borodino. But afterwards, he decided that he wanted to take the commission of bringing law and order to the Caucasus and put those squabbling tribes in that sort of Game of Thrones situation to rest. He abolished the Sheki Karabakh and Shirvan Khanates and created direct Russian control of the region. To the extent that people rebelled, he was willing to hang any and everyone who rebelled against him, including women and children, which created an immense amount of dislike for Yermolov. He was known in particular for his animus towards the Chechens. And he said, I desire that the terror of my name shall guard our frontiers more potently than chains or fortresses. And to many in the Caucasus today, he still has that kind of reputation. That said, it would be unfair to Yermolov to only talk about the way that he dealt with the indigenous Caucasian peoples. With regards to the Russian soldiers, he was incredibly helpful and forthcoming. He made numerous requests for increased medical assistance to the Russian soldiers that served with him, increased food rations, better care, shorter rotations, and decreasing the draft, preferring that fewer Russian soldiers come down to the Caucasus, only those that were needed. And Yermolov was deeply involved in the Caucasian Wars. Again, we talked about this a lot in episode 27. So if you want a more detailed analysis, it's there. But what's really important to point out is that in addition to the mobilized forces of the Russian army, there were also the Terek Cossacks. And the Cossacks were sort of tribal Russians that had moved in as settlers into this new territory. You can think actually very similarly to the way that the American government incentivized homesteaders to move into the middle part of America. And naturally, these people formed their own military brigades or quasi-military brigades in order to deal with the indigenous Caucasians who took none too lightly that their territory was being taken from them. Many of them hid in mountaintop cities called auls, and these auls were very difficult to access, very thin mountain passes. And the Terek Cossacks and the Russian military were responsible for fighting the Caucasians in these auls. Many of the Caucasians rallied behind key generals from different ethnic groups. Ethnic groups that had previously been fighting against each other often came into alliance now to deal with the Russians. Perfect example was Qızılbaş who we can see on the upper right-hand side. Qızılbaş was a Circassian leader, and while many of the higher class of Circassians allied with the Russians, Qızılbaş preferred to stay with the other Caucasians, and he fought side by side with Avars, with Dagestanis, with Chechens, in order to try and keep the Russians out. When he died, the major leader became Imam Shamil from Dagestan, and he was responsible for prolonging the fight against the Russians. And in Russia today, he still has a very strong reaction. He's ironically seen very positively by many Russians because of how valiantly he fought, despite the fact that he was a deep enemy of the Russians and very angry at their position in trying to take over his native Dagestan. The end result, of course, was particularly devastating to the Circassians, who were subject to a genocide in 1864 to 1867. This genocide would claim, as I pointed out in episode 27, roughly 750,000 to 800,000 Circassians died. Roughly the same amount of number were expelled from their homeland, leaving only 100,000 Circassians in their ancestral homeland. Most of these people who were expelled arrived in the ports of the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire put them to use in the sense of they were resettled to areas where the Ottomans felt that they needed more local support. And as Muslims, the Circassians were trusted over other minorities in the empire, particularly in Bulgaria. You have a lot of Circassians that were moved to Bulgaria specifically because Bulgaria had a large Turkish population, but also a large Bulgarian Christian population, and revolt there was increasingly likely. So, with this British alliance, you begin to see increasing upgrades to the forces held by Abbas Mirza after the Treaty of Gulistan in 1813. And so Abbas Mirza decides that he wants to try out his new forces, his Nizam-e-Jadid, his new system, and attack the Ottoman Empire. And so he leads an invasion starting in 1821. And that invasion first hits Doğu Bayezid, or Bayezid Castle, which you can see on the lower right-hand side. This is a picture of the Ottomans defending the castle against the Russians in the 1870s, but it's the same castle. And so the Nizam-i Jadid besieged this castle and took it actually relatively quickly. Then they moved to the city of Erzurum, and also won a stunning battle at Erzurum. Despite having fewer forces, Abbas Mirza was able to use his infantry effectively and defeat quite clearly the Ottoman forces. For the next 2 years, they fought in a sort of stalemate until in 1823, the Treaty of Erzurum was signed, which, while keeping the border at the same place it had been, granted the Persians numerous concessions within the Ottoman Empire, particularly the ability to represent all Persian citizens within the Ottoman Empire as an external voice. If that sounds slightly familiar, it's because that's the same position that the Russians had taken with regards to the Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire in the Treaty of Küçükçayırca, and it was the same position that the French had taken relative to the Catholics in the Ottoman Empire. So, but this is the first time that it had been granted by the Ottoman Empire to a Muslim state, and the only time this would ever be granted to another Muslim state. And the Persians had guaranteed permission to go on pilgrimages to Mesopotamia, where the Shiite holy sites were. There's a question of what is the relation between the terms Circassian and Caucasian. As far as I know, there isn't any. Circassian is an English rendering of the term Cherkess, which was the way that most people in the region referred to them. Their own name for themselves is Adigay. The term Caucasian, I actually don't know what the linguistic origin of Caucasian is, but I don't believe it has anything to do with the Circassians. As for the use of Caucasian to refer to whites as opposed to the people of the Caucasus, I think that was simply chosen as a way to make it sound more scientific, in the same way that people use the term Mongoloid to refer to East Asians because it sounds more scientific, or Negroid to refer to the people of Africa, again, because it sounded more scientific, not because it has any basis in actual phenotypical analysis or genetic science. I mean, there's a point that the Caucasus is the origin of the word Caucasian, and yes, but I don't know where the origin of the name Caucasus, as in the name of the mountains, comes from. So we then have a new Russo-Persian War, because inspired by the victory against the Ottomans in 1823, and seeing the way that Yermolov had been treating the people of the Caucasus, there was a lot of rage in Persia. And so there was an attempt to invade those Russian-controlled territories and take them back. In 1826, many of the former Khans decided to ally with Persia. When Fatali decided to allow Abbas Mirza to launch the invasion, Abbas Mirza basically waltzed into many of the former Khanate cities, such as Sheki and Ganja, because these rulers decided that they would rather put their weight with the Persians, who would give them some kind of suzerainty, than the Russians, who would strip it from them completely. Now, it's worth pointing out that Abbas Mirza did not fight with the full force of the Persian Empire, and this came down to that organizational style of government that Fatali Shah had been willing to accept, which was that decentralized model. So almost all of his troops came from Iranian Azerbaijan, which is the part of Iran that borders on the Caucasus. You can see on the map on the lower right-hand side, that's the area in yellow, hard yellow. But he didn't get troops from other areas of Persia, and so his troop numbers were relatively small. Now, it's still larger than what the Russians were able to field, but the Russians had much more advanced equipment than the Persians had at this point. So in 1826, the Russians launched their counter-invasion and took the city of Ganja. back from the Persians. They also fought a number of battles that eventually forced the Persians to reconsider their position. In particular, you had the arrival of Paskievich, the Russian general who superseded Yermolov, in the city of Echmiadzin, which is the center of the Armenian church. But the war really came to an end in 1828 when, using the fleet of the Caspian, Paskievich threatened that he would launch an amphibious invasion of North Persia if Abbas Mirza would not sign a peace treaty. And so that's what happened. At the city of Turkmenchai, Paskievich and Abbas Mirza signed a peace treaty, ceding areas in what is now Armenia, Nakhichevan of Azerbaijan, and the Talysh regions of Azerbaijan to the Russian government. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. The Ottomans had also lost a war in 1829, which forced them to cede those areas that are hashed in green. So the Russians were able to cut Circassia off from access to the sea, and were able to bring all of Georgia under their control, unifying the territory of Georgia. There's something else worth mentioning, which is the Armenian repatriation. So you can see on the map in the center that there are these areas that are in blue and in different colors of brown. One of the provisions of the Treaty of Turkmenchai was that Armenians would be allowed to return to the historic region of Armenia. And so the Russians began an intense repopulation effort to bring Armenians into what was at that time called the Erivan Khanat, or the Erivan government. Erivan being the Turkish pronunciation of Yerevan. Now, this is not to say that Armenians didn't have a history in this region. They absolutely did. But at this point in time, they were only 20% of the population in that territory. So this repopulation came in several waves, and you can see the different colors represent different waves of immigrants. The blue are the ones that came in 1828 to 1829, and you can see that they shore up many of the southern areas of Armenia. Later immigrations hit further northward, such that by 1897, despite only being 20% of the population in 1828, they were now 55% of the population. Now, let's delve a little bit deeper into the Treaty of Turkmenchai. So we talked about the Armenian resettlement, and that was part of an overall, quote, return of captives. Now, when we say captives, these were people who at some point were stolen from their homes in the Caucasus by Turkic nomads, probably from what's today northern Iran, northwestern Iran, and were sold into slavery, sexual slavery, but they would eventually convert to Islam. They would be manumitted, they would have relationships. And so, yes, it was true that they were taken against their will, but they were taken against their will 30, 40 years ago. And so they had become part and parcel of the society in which they now lived. Would some of them have preferred to be repatriated to their homeland? Absolutely. Did all of them? Certainly not. But the Russians couldn't see the distinction between Group A and Group B, which incensed Persians that Russians now had the permission to go into Persian homes and take out these captives and bring them back to the Caucasus region. And while it wasn't just Armenians that were taken in this way, Georgians were also brought back to the Caucasus. It was seen as disproportionately affecting Armenians. Another piece was that Abbas Mirza had agreed to pay an indemnity of 20 million rubles to the Russians. And you can see the picture in the upper left-hand side is in the city of Tabriz in the northern part of Iran, the collection of this war indemnity for its payment to the Russians, seated at the far side of the table. We also noticed that the British didn't assist Abbas Mirza during his fight from 1826 to 1828, and the British said that they wouldn't interfere specifically because Abbas Mirza was the aggressor. According to the Treaty of Friendship and Alliance, if Persia were the aggressor, then Britain was not compelled to act, and in this case, Britain had no interest in acting. And the Russians were also given concessions to trade freely within Persia and be able to spread their goods into Persian markets. This defeat was so overwhelming that it risked the possibility of the Qajar dynasty collapsing under the threat of riots and protests. And so the Russians guaranteed that Abbas Mirza would be the successor to Fath Ali Shah, and accordingly, they would make sure that no riot broke out that would prevent this event from occurring, and that Russia would be the guarantor of Persian succession, which, of course, this gives Russia a direct hand in the control and future of the Persian governance. And you can see that this mirrors in many ways the Treaty of Küçükkaynarca that we just talked about, right? We have the Russians protecting in this case, Armenians as opposed to the Orthodox, right? By taking these captives back. We have an indemnity. We have the Russians being able to choose. In that case, they would choose the Caliph of Crimea. In this case, they're choosing, they're supporting the choice of the Persian Shah. And in any case, the Russians were using the same model to bring Persia further and further under its control. And in 1828, the Russian embassy in Persia begins to have a new leader, and its new leader is Alexander Griboyedov. Griboyedov is probably not the right person to have sent here, and that's he was a literary and artistic person. He was actually a very close friend of Pushkin, and and so as that kind of person, he probably didn't have the kind of crisis knowledge that he should have had in order to deal with the increasing antagonism that most Persian people felt towards the invasiveness of the Treaty of Turkmenchai. The result was that mullahs began to agitate against the Russians, and that agitation came to a head when an Armenian eunuch and 2 Armenian slaves fled to the Russian embassy seeking protection and return to the Caucasus region, which was permitted under that return of captives. That said, the Persians didn't much like this and used the event as sort of a staging for the grievances that they had had against the Russians for all of the violations of Turkmenchai. And so on the 30th of January, 1829, the embassy was attacked by a mob. Griboyedov and almost all the Russians, 1 or 2 escaped. None of the Armenians who sought refuge were known to escape. All these people were killed. Griboyedov is rumored to have said as his last words, "Fath Ali Shah, je m'en fous," meaning in French, right? Fath Ali Shah, you're driving me crazy, or I'm sick of it. This was received in St. Petersburg about as well as you could imagine. The Russian embassy in Tehran was attacked, and the Russians summoned the Persians to give an account of the event. In fact, they were beginning to bring about the war machine to begin another war with Persia as a response to this casus belli. Fath Ali Shah, however, sent his grandson Khosrow to St. Petersburg with the Shah diamond and presented it, one of the wealthiest jewels of Persia, to the Russians as an apology for the destruction of the embassy and for the murder of Griboyedov. You can see a replay of that in this movie from the lower right-hand side, the presentation of the diamond in in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. Now, because Fath Ali Shah did this and made rapprochement, the Russians were willing to let bygones be bygones and try to restore a relationship with Iran. People may notice that this is almost the exact opposite reaction that occurred when the American embassy was stormed in 1979, also on the encouragement of Iranian mullahs. The Iranian government stood behind the sacking of the embassy and promoted it as part of its anti-American campaign, leading to the dissolution of Iranian and American relations after that point. So, when Russia guaranteed that Abbas Mirza would succeed Fath Ali Shah, they hadn't counted on the fact that Abbas Mirza actually would predecease Fath Ali Shah. And so Abbas Mirza's son, Muhammad Shah, was appointed to be the new Shah. And he was appointed because the British and the Russians both really liked the fact that he didn't seem like he was going to rock the boat. He was a very mellow ruler, completely disinterested in the reforms that could make further changes within the Persian Empire difficult for either the Russians or the British to handle. But he did come under more Russian sway than any Shah before him, and he was convinced by the Russians to attack the city of Herat in Afghanistan. Herat had always been part of the historic Persian territories, and so this would assuage in many ways the feelings of loss that Persians had over the loss of the Caucasus if they were able to take Herat. Now, of course, the Kingdom of Afghanistan was a British client state, so the Russians were more than happy to see that state weakened. And you can see on the right-hand side, these are the preparations for the invasion of Herat. And while Herat was besieged, a number of Afghan tribes, a number of Turkic tribes like the Aymak, the Uzbek, came together with Pashtuns to reinforce the city and to resupply it against the besiegers. And so while the siege took place, it was not fruitful. The British were able, through the seizure of Kharg Island to compel Muhammad Shah to disengage from the invasion of Afghanistan. At the same time, Muhammad Shah was dealing with punitive raids from the states in Central Asia, particularly Khiva and Bukhara, which you can see on that map in dark green and in purple. Khiva and Bukhara had sent a number of raiders into Persia, especially into the region of Khorasan, which had deeply depopulated that region. And this invasion of Herat also solved the problem of dealing with them, because many of them had allied with the Afghan Emirate in order to repel the Persians. They had suffered enough in that engagement to leave Persia alone. Now, the economy, which had been doing relatively well under Fath Ali Shah, was now inundated with manufactured textile imports, especially from Russia, because of the new free trade agreement that was part of the Treaty of Turkmenchai and increasing trade with the British. This led to riots throughout the bazaars from all the merchants who were selling locally produced textiles, which couldn't compete on price or quality with those that were being imported. Of course, those merchants who were making money selling the imports were not involved in the rioting and just stayed silent. Now, as I mentioned, Afghanistan was a British client state, but the British were always worried that Afghanistan might slip out of their indirect control. And so that was what resulted in 1839 to 1842, when Dost Muhammad Khan began to pursue a more independent-minded strategy than the British would otherwise have liked. So they supported one of his opponents, and in 1839 began a wide-scale invasion of Afghanistan. You can see here the Battle of Ghazni, where they overtook the castle. The Afghans fought a long-term guerrilla campaign, Sounds very familiar, I'm sure, to people listening here. And after 3 years, the British decided that it wasn't worth maintaining troops in Afghanistan. At the same time, Dost Muhammad Khan, who, in exile, lived in Calcutta and had made better relations with the British. And the British saw that having a leader like him in power as a bulwark against Russia to the north would be better than trying to directly control Afghanistan. For his part, Dost Muhammad Khan liked the fact that the British were going to war with the Sikh Empire, right, which was the empire to his south. And so he and the British could work together to dismantle the Sikh Empire and increase the power of the Afghan Emirate. So now we get sort of to the religious minorities. And so it's worth taking a second to talk about the situation of the Jews, especially in the 1830s in Persia. The Jewish situation in the 1830s was bad. Pretty much everywhere that's in that red area, cities such as Tehran, Mashhad, Shiraz, Isfahan, all of them saw pogroms against the Jewish population led by extremist clerics. There are different reasons that the agitation occurred. And in the region of Azerbaijan, right, that area south of Tabriz, Jews were pretty much pogromed out of the entire region. Now, there were different reasons that these extremist imams would cite. Many of them derive from the concept of najis, or uncleanliness. And the Safavid ulama had taught that Jews were in a constant state of ritual impurity, or najis, and that contact with a Jew would spread that najis to you. It got so extreme to the point that if a rain droplet hit a Jew and then hit a Shiite Muslim, that Shiite Muslim would be in a state of najis as well, because the rain droplet had conveyed that impurity from the Jew to the Shiite believer. So in particular, for example, you have the Al-Haddad, or the Judgment of God, which occurred in Mashhad in 1839. And the Al-Haddad was a large-scale pogrom against the Jews of the city. It was in particular based on a rather sad story. So there was a Jewish woman, and she had a disease, and she went to the apothecary, who told her that she should kill a dog and press her hand to its blood while it was bleeding to death in order to cure her of this disease. And so that's what she did. She slaughtered this dog for those medical reasons, and she put her hand on its throat to get its blood. It happened that when she slaughtered this dog, it happened to be the 10th of Muharram, the 10th of Ashura, which is that day when the Persians, when the Shiite Muslims commemorate the death of Ali. And the death of the dog was seen as particularly insensitive to Shiite sensibilities. And so 35 Jews were just killed point blank, and the rest of the families of the cities were hunted down. Some of them converted to be what were called Jadidis, or new Muslims. And many of these Jadidis actually were crypto Jews. And so you can see this family is believed to have been a crypto Jewish family after the Al-Haddad, living in Mashhad. And this was a common phenomenon throughout Iran until, and in each city, these pogroms would go on until more tolerant clerics were able to lead by their own example. While I couldn't find the names of any of the clerics who led by example in this period, I wanted to draw attention to Marja Sayyid Hussein Borujardi, who lived about 100 years later. Now, as a Marja, as a Shiite leader, he was also a Grand Ayatollah, and he made it very clear that the Jews of Iran were to be respected during his life. He saw that many Shiites would throw rocks at the Jewish community, and even when he ordered them to stop doing so, they refused. So he coordinated his day to march alongside wherever the Jews were in large number, so that way the Persians wouldn't throw rocks for fear of hitting him, because hitting him would be a cardinal sin to the Shiites, and he managed to actually protect the Jewish community in that way. Another interesting thing is that Borujardi had the perspective that the Grand Ayatollah should stay completely out of politics. So while he was alive, he refused to come out and speak openly on the Israeli-Palestinian situation, which existed during his lifetime, and he refused to comment on the legitimacy or lack of legitimacy of the Shah, of Mossadegh, all of those other issues that we will eventually cover when we get to Iran in the 20th century. I have a question of what does crypto Jews mean? And crypto Jews are individuals who outwardly profess to not be Jewish. Either they profess to be Christian or Muslim or some other religion, and then in their homes and private, they will perform Jewish rituals. It's an insincere conversion, but a conversion done to avoid violence or death. Now, we're going to talk about another faith that develops in Iran, but in order to get there, we have to sort of remember a little bit about what 12er Shiite Islam is. And so we have this line of rightly guided imams. And the Shiites believe that these imams are sort of a quasi-prophetic lineage. They cannot be prophets because, as Muhammad said, he was the last prophet, but they provide guidance and a connection to the divine that will allow people to further understand the world. And we talked about the first division, right? That was the Zaydis, and they broke off in the 700s. We talked about that in episode 4 of the series. Sorry. Either episode 4 or episode 5. And then if you follow Muhammad al-Baqir to the top of the next, you see the split between the Seveners or the Ismailis on the right-hand side. The Nizari Ismailis continue after Nizar ibn Mustansir all the way to Aga Khan IV, who is the current Nizari Ismaili Imam. I believe he is the 44th Imam in their lineage. But if you go on the left-hand side where the 12ers are, you see that you get to Muhammad ibn al-Hassan al-Mahdi, and he is the 12th Imam. But he went into hiding, into occultation, in the Islamic year 260, roughly equivalent to the Gregorian year 880, 900, somewhere around there. So you can see that, So and the Muslim year, to be clear, is a little bit shorter than the Gregorian year. So you can see how we're getting towards the 1000th anniversary on the Islamic calendar of Muhammad ibn al-Hassan al-Mahdi's occultation. So because we were at this auspicious moment, where we're getting close to the Islamic year 1260, right? 1000 years after the year 260, there were a lot of Shiite Muslims who were in a state where they were believing in millenarian beliefs. They were believing that the world was going to end, that the hidden Imam was going to come out of hiding, and that they needed to find somebody who could have access to him. You needed a gateway or a door. And in Arabic, the word for door is bab. So one person came forward. This is Sayyid Ali Muhammad Shirvani. You can see him on the right-hand side. And Sayyid Ali Muhammad Shirvani claimed to be the bab, this door to the hidden Imam, that he could channel where the hidden Imam was and tell his rulings and beliefs to the common people. He began to create a group of disciples that followed him called the Living Letters. These Living Letters were people who would be knowledgeable about the secrets of the hidden Imam before he was able to return. Now, Sayyid Ali Muhammad Shirvani made a number of pronouncements that were deeply antithetical to the Shiite structure of Iran at that time, and exposed the problems with the ulama, the Shiite scholars, in terms of the corruption and power that they wielded in Iranian society. Probably his most famous sermons were on the equality of women. He believed that the requirement to wear the veil, the requirement of women to stay in the home, the requirement of women to be treated differently than men, was something that was not a part of the true teaching of the hidden Imam. And so he agitated for the better treatment of women. He also argued that the Islamic prohibition on usury was ill-founded, and that interest could be used on loans and other repayment techniques. He also challenged the ulama on the punishments that they would inflict, arguing that they should be less harsh than otherwise. And he argued that children should be treated better than they were permitted under Shiite traditional teaching. So there were a number of living letters, but one in particular that I want to spend a little bit of time on is Fatima Baraghan Qazvini. She was from the city of Qazvin, and she often went by the name Qurrat al-Ain, or the Qurrat al-Ain, the calmness in the eye, is probably, yeah. And so she wrote a number of letters herself about women's equality. I don't know why this picture has her in a hijab or a chador, because she was very famous for refusing to wear it. She believed that the time of the chador was over, as the Bab had said. And unlike the Bab, who was put under house arrest in 1850, in 1848, when he declared that he was the hidden imam, when she was put under house arrest in 1850, was still able to communicate with the other living letters and still preserve the tradition of the Babis. The confrontations between the Babis and the government came to a head when two Babis decided to try and assassinate Nasruddin Shah, Muhammad Shah's successor. This assassination wasn't successful, but it meant that there would be massive government recriminations against the Babis, and many of the living letters were killed in ambushes or direct attacks on their compounds. The Bab predicted that following him there would be a prophet who would be able to fully realize the teachings of the hidden imam. And so a number of people claim this title. The one who was probably the best at doing so was Mirza Hussein Ali Nuri, who became known as Baha'u'llah, the one who God has made manifest. Now, Baha'u'llah was expelled from Iran in 1853, but he and not before being imprisoned in the Siyad. But he made his way to the Ottoman Empire, and in the Ottoman Empire, he was repeatedly jailed, but he was allowed to live, and so he continued writing, and he ended up writing his seminal book called the Kitab-i Aqdas, meaning the holiest book, and many of the Babis began to follow Baha'u'llah. There were some minorities who didn't. Some of them believed that they should only continue to follow the Bab and not Baha'u'llah. Some of them believe that they should follow Baha'u'llah's older brother, Azal, Subhi Azal, and those are called Azali. But almost all of the Babis ended up becoming followers of Baha'u'llah, also known as Bahá'i. Now, the last place that he stayed before he died was a prison in the city of Haifa, in today's Israel. And so accordingly, the world center of the Baha'i is built there in Haifa, including the shrine of the Bab, and the Bab's remains were interred there. So because Mirza Hussein Ali Nuri, Baha'u'llah, was alive for so long in all these prisons, he was able to write down his beliefs and was able to clarify what is going on within this religion. And because of that, the religion survived. Now, as we pointed out in episode 1, post-Islamic, this is a post-Islamic religion. Babism, Azali, and Baha'i are post-Islamic religions that are all related to each other. And when I say post-Islamic, it means that they come out of Islam, but they violate key tenets of Islam, and so that puts them outside of the fold of Islam in a way that the Sunnis, the Shiites, the Ibadis really don't. And there are usually four different types of issues that they have. Baha'i has three out of the four. So we should talk a little bit about that. The Baha'u'llah was a prophet who came after Muhammad, according to the beliefs of the Baha'i. And in fact, you can see the Tajiliyat in the lower right-hand side. The Tajiliyat were effulgences, were letters that Baha'u'llah wrote after codifying the Kitab-i Aqdas, the holiest book. And in the Tajiliyat, Baha'u'llah makes clear that no one can come to God but through him, that he is a prophet, an emanation, a manifestation of the divine will, and therefore he is a person that is providing the answers for his followers. Now, we should also point out that while most of the post-Islamic religions have issues with Tawheed, or the unity of God, this is not an issue within Baha'i, which stresses the unity of God and the singleness of God. And so that concept of Tawheed, which is so central in Islam, does continue to be manifest in Baha'i. At no point, despite considering him a manifestation of God's will, himself a manifestation of God's will, Baha'u'llah never claims to be a divinity, never claims divine powers, only that he is in connection with the divine. We also see a huge amount of syncretic and reinterpretive behavior among the Baha'i, looking at different Quranic verses and understanding them as being symbolic, not being literal, looking at various biblical verses, understanding them to be symbolic, not literal. And his understanding of the world is very much shrouded in this batiniya. And it's important that we re-examine what batiniya is. Batiniya is that the surface level of our world is not an accurate representation of what is. It is simply how we engage with the world that we see. But that engagement isn't based on reality. It's based on that connection that we have. And so I like this picture from The Matrix because it illustrates in a very fundamental sense how people who believe in the batiniya see the batiniya. They see it the same way that Neo can see the lines of the Matrix when everybody else cannot. Neo is seeing the true nature of the reality that he is in, and other people that are seeing the surfaces, seeing the textures, are seeing what the code wants them to see, not what is truly there. And so one of the important things for Baha'i worshippers to do is to discover the batiniya, discover that higher level of a reality that we don't necessarily access with our senses, but we do through our understanding of the revelations of the Baha'u'llah. One of the interesting points that shows the syncretic and reinterpretive nature, the reinterpretive nature of Baha'i is the idea of heaven and hell. In Baha'i, heaven and hell are not places that a person goes to after they die, be they spiritual places or otherwise. Heaven and hell are statuses, are conditions. The body naturally oscillates between closeness and further or awayness from God. And when you are close to God, when you're in a position where you are in communion with the divine, that sensation is heaven. And when you are far away from God in that oscillation, being unable to connect with God, that lack of connection is seen as hell. In many ways, this echoes a lot of Jewish tradition on the concept of devekut, or attachment to God, but is very different than Islam or than Islamic belief, which assert that hell, Gehenom, is a place, and heaven, Jannah, or paradise, is a place to which your soul ascends after death. In the same way, the Baha'i stress that death was not actually a true thing, in that it doesn't actually create a separation that is a true meaningful separation between the living and the dead. And so if a person is able to connect on a high spiritual level, they can commune with the dead. They can have dreams where dead people talk to them, and those are actual communications between the dead and the living. This is because, as I said, death is just a different state of existence, and the unity of humanity is one unity. To this end, Baha'i has generally been in favor of abolishing all prejudicial claims, be they men against women, be they against different religious sects, be they against any governmental authority. The Baha'i see all people as being interconnected, both dead and alive. They don't even see that as a fundamental divide. The Baha'u'llah and his son, Abdul Baha, codified the teachings of Baha'i, and they argue that there is a search for truth, that any portion of religion that is inconsistent with science should be thrown out, that science is one part of understanding the Batiniya, the religious experience is another part of understanding the Batiniya. That women should be equal, that there should be no real clergy. There are leaders in the Baha'i movement, in the Baha'i religion, but to the extent that we can say they have power over worshippers or that they run a service, that's just not the case. Services are generally run on an individual level. Baha'i also is one of the first religions that I'm aware of that makes a direct appeal to governments instituting caps on the amount that a person can own and minimums on the amount that a person should have to survive, meaning that there shouldn't be extreme wealth and poverty. He wouldn't be a socialist. Baha'u'llah certainly would have been aware of Marx. His writings did circulate in the Ottoman Empire, but he wouldn't have been a socialist by any means. He didn't believe that wealth should be redistributed, but that the government should have a role in preventing people from acquiring too much wealth or too little wealth in order to survive. And to stress this concept of unity with all of humanity, the symbol of the Baha'i was the 9-pointed star. But according to the teachings of Baha'u'llah, 9 is the smallest possible number that integrates the entirety of humanity. So we then move on after 1848 with the death of Muhammad Shah. His son Nasir-ad-Din Shah took power at a very young age, and he appointed Amir Kabir, who you can see in the large picture, as his first prime minister. Amir Kabir was his nickname. It means the big prince in Arabic. And Amir Kabir was hated by both the British and the Russians. The Russians thought he was in bed with the British thought he was in bed with the Russians. Either way, they didn't like him primarily because he actually was moving Persia in the right direction for Persia. The first thing he did was that he reviewed the financial expenditures of the regime, which were deeply negative. Persia had been taking numerous loans from both the British and the Russians, and a lot of that money was going to the expensive tastes of the court in Tehran. So he cut those court pensions and court finances, which of course engendered him numerous enemies in the high court of Persia. He also created the Dar al-Funun, or the House of Art, which was a polytechnic school. And that polytechnic school would eventually come to serve as one of the elite military institutions within Persia by the end of the 19th century. They translated numerous manuals from French or English into Persian in order to educate Persians on modern warfare, such as grenades and more and larger scale cannons. In addition to those later changes to the military, he reformed the military as it was, putting it under a more European style of conscription and organization with top-down leadership, very similar to the federal style of Nader Shah. He also intervened in the wealth acquisition within Persia, trying to settle some of the disputes between the bazaar leaders and other merchants. He also tried to make improvements to agronomy, instituting better cultivation practices throughout Persia. And finally, he was responsible for the creation of the first manufacturers and factories within Persia. It's possible that had Amir Kabir been able to rule as prime minister for 10, 15 years, he may have overseen a transformation in Persia similar to the Tanzimat reforms in the Ottoman Empire. But we have to go back to the fact that he cut the court pensions, and the courtiers were really not happy about that. And so they convinced Nasruddin Shah, who was a very young man at the time, that Amir Kabir was dangerous and to have him killed. So in 1852, after roughly 3 years on the throne, 3 years in power, Amir Kabir was assassinated and lost his ability to improve the empire. To give you a sense of how bad the infrastructure was as a result of this removal, there is this is a map on the left-hand side of all of the railroads in Iran in 1860. You can see the map is empty for a reason. There was only one railroad, and it was within the city of Tehran. It went about 5 kilometers, and it connected the shrine of Shah Abdulazim to the main center of the city. At that time, the shrine was in a small village. Tehran had not expanded to the size that it is today. To put it in perspective, Tehran is a city of 8 million people today. And this village has been swallowed up by the expansion of the city. But that was the entire length of Iran's infrastructure in terms of trains. And of course, there was a clear reason why the British and Russians were deeply opposed to the building of railroads throughout Iran. The primary reason, of course, is that if you have railroads, then you'll be able to send soldiers throughout the country. And considering that the soldiers were beginning to modernize, that could prove a threat to Russian or British intentions with regards to Persia. I think we're getting close to the witching hour, so I think this is actually a really great place to stop. And we'll continue this piece when we go over the end of the Qajar dynasty in about a month from now. So, questions, comments, concerns? All right then. It was really nice to see everybody tonight. Thank you for all the questions. And next week we are doing the Kurds and the Assyrians, who are the non-Arabs of northern Mesopotamia. We'll cover their sort of longer historical past. And then the week following, we'll cover Ottoman Iraq and the Ottoman Levant. Following that, we switch back to our Central Ottoman Empire coverage, and we talk about the reign of Abdul Hamid II and the Young Turk Revolution. And then we follow that with the developments in the Balkans that lead to the Balkan Wars just before World War I. So, I'll see everybody next week then. All right. Bye.